Welsh Procurement Alliance is a public sector and not-for-profit procurement organisation, setting up OJEU-compliant framework agreements for the construction, refurbishment and maintenance of social housing and public buildings. Contracting authorities can then use these frameworks to ensure they get quick and easy access to a set of pre-evaluated companies for both price and quality, either through a direct award or mini competition, whilst ensuring they are compliant with procurement rules. WPA likes to support CHC as we believe their vision of a Wales where good housing is a basic right for all is closely linked to our aim to deliver better buildings and homes that enhance local communities. Decarbonisation of the housing stock and alleviating fuel poverty is core to both of these statements to ensure a prosperous future for not just this generation but future generations. The WPA has a decarbonisation and energy efficiency framework known as N8, which allows local authorities, social landlords and other public sector bodies to source specialist suppliers for the installation of 21 energy efficiency measures and associated works, delivered through 2 work streams and across 4 regional lots within Wales. This fully OJEU compliant framework is suitable for low, medium and high-rise housing schemes, schools, colleges and all other types of public sector buildings. Consultancy and project management support is also available through the Energy Efficiency Consultancy Services Framework known as N8C.
Good morning to you all, and a very, very warm welcome to CHC's Decarbonisation Conference. I was delighted to be asked to chair this event today, and I have a few practical announcements to make before we kick the conference off. We're keen to make a noise on Twitter throughout the conference, so please get involved via Twitter at CHC Events, #DecarbConf21. We would like to see our hashtag trending because this is a really important conference. You can't see them, but we have the events team here, Laura, Leslie, Rhian and Terry-Ann, who are working hard behind the scenes to keep us online. If you have any problems, please head to the CHC help desk based in the Expo area. I know that not all of you will be able to stay with us throughout the whole day, although please do your best. All the contributors and the workshop sessions will be recorded, so you can catch up on the sessions that you weren't able to attend after the conference. And please make use of the excellent networking opportunities provided by the Hop-In conference platform to meet colleagues and speakers. You can ask questions during the sessions via the chat function, and we'll be looking out for those. And the questions that come in on the chat function, I'm happy to put to the speakers within the time. We'll also be running polls throughout the day to capture your views and feedback. And so now to the business of the day. I am particularly delighted to welcome you to this decarbonisation conference at a very propitious time just before COP26 in Glasgow, possibly the most important global climate conference ever convened by the UN. There's been a great deal happening over the last few years in the context of the Welsh Government and Welsh local authorities responding to the climate change challenge. In 2019, the Welsh Government was the first government in the UK to declare a climate emergency, recognising that climate change threatens Wales's health, economy, infrastructure and natural environment. And that was very closely followed by the Parliament itself and by many of the Welsh local authorities. This was backed up by a new Welsh law in 2020, which enshrined the UK Climate Change Committee's advice to set a net zero target for Wales by 2050. And I'm really grateful to the Welsh Procurement Alliance for sponsoring this conference. You heard the message from our sponsor a few moments ago, but it's really important to think how rapidly procurement in Wales is changing. In March of this year, the Welsh Government issued a new Wales procurement policy statement of principles requiring the Welsh public sector to follow 10 principles of procuring well-being for Wales based on Wales's unique Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act and key Welsh Government policies. And these 10 principles aim to leverage collaborative procurement to maximise long-term sustainable social and economic value outcomes from public spend, to integrate procurement into the heart of Welsh policy, to progress long-term sustainable procurement, to raise the long-term standing and profile of the procurement profession, to support policy objectives such as the foundational economy and circular economy Wales through collaborative place-based procurement activity, which nurtures resilient local supply chains, to prevent climate change by prioritising carbon reduction and zero emissions to more responsible and sustainable procurement to deliver the government's ambition for net zero public sector Wales by 2030, to increase stakeholder involvement and to collaborate with stakeholders to promote equal opportunities and fair work for Wales, to maximise the use of procurement data to support decision making and to promote value-based procurement to deliver optimum long-term outcomes for Wales. Now, what interests me about those, as somebody who's followed the procurement debate for years, these are unique to Wales and they present a huge opportunity for all Welsh organisations to have permission to think differently. Now, following the most recent Welsh general election, a new and very active ministry to tackle climate change has been established, with the minister and her deputy responsible for tackling 3 of the 4 main elements in the context of climate change. Now, from my perspective, this has been a long time coming. When I held a similar portfolio in government between 2007 and 2011, the government was able to support the RBED programme, which refurbished 26,000 social housing homes with low carbon technologies. I was surprised to find out recently that it is still the largest programme of its type that has ever been carried out in the United Kingdom, and such performance has not been sustained. This conference is focusing on practical learning, and I commend the organisers for bringing together a really interesting range of contributors to both inspire you and to help you on your low carbon journey. And I'm particularly delighted to see that there's already a huge body of work within CHC members which can be celebrated today, particularly within the workshops where conference participants can play a full and active role. We know that decarbonisation programmes can have huge positive effects on the foundational economy. New jobs can be created, training opportunities can be established, and local supply chains can be kick-started and supported. This is needed now more than ever, given that we're still recovering from the coronavirus pandemic. Decarbonisation is good for the environment, good for the economy, and it can be good for tenants. Energy efficient homes are more affordable to run. They're warmer and they're better qualified in terms of tackling fuel poverty and preventing the exacerbation of cold related illnesses such as respiratory problems. I know that housing associations in Wales are ambitious to decarbonise, and to decarbonise not just homes but businesses, services and communities too. Today, we'll engage, support and motivate you to scale up and undertake decarbonisation in the most effective, sustainable and quickest ways. We have a range of inspirational speakers at this conference today, and I'm delighted that those speakers are all driving forward an agenda which needs to pick up speed dramatically if the aspirations of COP26 to keep the 2015 Paris Agreement's commitment of holding down the warming of the world to under 2 degrees and to as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. So I hope you're settling down this morning to fully partake in this conference opportunity, to prepare to be inspired, to be challenged, but most importantly, to take a set of ideas away from this conference today into your daily work so that you too become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. So why are we here now, today? This conference aims to support attendees to understand the importance of decarbonisation and housing's role in tackling climate change. It aims to motivate you to engage attendees to undertake decarbonisation programmes. It aims to give attendees ideas about how they can scale up, where potential sources of finance will come from, and how they can engage with tenants on decarbonisation. It aims to use the main speaker sessions to outline the bigger picture and motivate attendees, while the workshops will look at practical ways that attendees can tackle the challenge of decarbonisation. And I'm fully aware already, as I know the ministers will be, of the CHC policy asks on decarbonisation. But capital investment should be prioritised and measured according to the impact it can have on future generations to support a shift to an economy that is founded on well-being principles. And that should include the following priority spend areas for this government: a 5-year, 1.5 billion investment programme of 20,000 new energy efficient social homes, and a 10-year, £4 billion stimulus package backed by a mix of public and private funding to retrofit social homes. So I'm sure that will be in all our minds as we move now onto the conference programme. And so to business, and to introduce our first speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Luke Murphy, Head of the Environmental Justice Commission at the IPPR. Before joining the IPPR in 2016, Luke worked in Parliament, the voluntary sector and the private sector. He worked for the Labour Party as a policy and political advisor for a shadow Secretary of State and successive shadow housing ministers, helping lead their work on housing and on local government and devolution. He's worked on policy and advocacy projects for the Living Wage Foundation and the leading housing association. And Luke has also a significant experience in communications and campaigning. You will have heard Luke perhaps on Radio 4. You'll have seen him on Newsnight and other BBC programmes. So Luke, it gives me huge pleasure to welcome you to this conference today. And as somebody who contributed to one of the IPPR's climate assemblies in the South Wales valleys, I'm particularly delighted to welcome you back to Wales. Luke, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's really great to be here today to speak to everyone about the issue of the green transition and the climate and nature emergency. And it was fantastic as well to have Jane's contribution, as she just said then, to what our citizens jury in the South Wales Valleys, which is one of the things actually that I'm keen to talk about today. And thanks to CHC for having me here. I think I just wanted to begin by saying that action on the climate and nature crisis is urgent, and I think few people attending today, or indeed the public at large, need convincing of that. And the crucial question that we have to answer now is about how we transition. And at IPPR, where I lead the work on climate and energy, this is something that we've been thinking about quite a lot over the past few years. Indeed, our cross-party Environmental Justice Commission, which commissioned 4 citizens' juries across the country to look at what a fair transition would look like in those areas, speaking to citizens to try to understand what that approach should look like. And that's where I want to focus my contribution today, because we know that decarbonisation is moving into a new phase, from one that's been conducted in the background, achieved by reducing emissions in the power sector, to one that touches on people's everyday lives. And we're all going to have to change the way that we heat our homes, how we get around, what we eat, and for some, the work that they do. But the crucial message of my contribution today is that it is also an opportunity to improve people's quality of life. While many environmentalists, including myself, talk about the co-benefits of the transition, the citizens we have spoken to as part of our work largely just talk about the benefits, the new jobs, the chance to improve people's health and well-being and tackle poverty, and many of those things that Jane just highlighted. And housing decarbonisation, as I will come on to later, is a huge opportunity to deliver these kinds of benefits. But through our work, what we heard from people and communities right across the country was that this transformation, if you like, must be rooted in fairness, not just because the poorest communities are least responsible for these crises and invariably the worst affected, but because unless it is rooted in fairness, it simply won't succeed. I'm going to do my Chris Whitty act now and say next slide, please. To help inform how we think the UK and indeed Wales should respond to the climate and nature emergencies, we ran, as I mentioned, and as Jane mentioned just a moment ago, citizens' juries in places confronted with particular risks and opportunities as part of our cross-party environmental justice commission. And we ran them in 4 places across the UK. We ran one in Tees Valley in County Durham, an area that has industrial emissions which are 3 times the national average. We ran one in Thurrock, where that is a commuter town from London, and it is faced by heavy plans for future housing development, and is also on the river and has a lot of light industry. We ran one in Aberdeenshire, where there's obviously the oil and gas industry, and changes there are going to have a huge impact, but also a significant farming constituency as well. But we also ran one, as we already mentioned, in the South Wales Valleys, an area, as many people will know, and it won't take me to tell you this, that suffered from an unjust transition in the past, and in many ways an example of why a fair transition is so important, but also is reliant heavily on car use, and also has links with carbon-intensive industry as well. And everyone in each of those areas, groups of around 20 people representative of their area with a range of views and backgrounds, we brought them together to discuss what they think fair action would look like in tackling the climate and nature emergencies, because that was the core focus of the commission, not just how we could reduce emissions and restore nature, but how we could do so in a way that was fair and a way which would also address wider economic and social injustices. And everyone there heard from experts on potential solutions, but they are also experts in their own lives as well, experts in what it's like to live in their communities, experts on what fairness means to them, experts in their own lives. And their recommendations were ambitious, optimistic, and thorough, and they shaped the final report of our cross-party Environmental Justice Commission. And it's those some of those key themes and recommendations from those jurors that I wanted to focus on today, because and next slide, please. There were many recommendations specific to South Wales Valleys, specific to Tees Valley in County Durham, specific to Aberdeenshire and Thurrock as well. But there were themes that emerged from each the groups that, when brought together, we think should set out the course for a new way of approaching the climate and nature crises, which is relevant for governments, which is relevant for business, which is relevant for civil society, which is relevant for the third sector, relevant for housing associations. And I just want to take you through each of these shifts and then talk a little bit about the new social contract we think this should represent, of how we approach the climate and nature crisis, and then finish just focusing a little on what that might mean for housing. And the first shift really was that we need to move from a mentality about this just being a problem to be mitigated to an opportunity to be seized. Actually, the citizens that we spoke to in every area said that actually action in response to the climate and nature crisis can be about more than, and I quote, staving off the worst. It can actually be about making life better for people, particularly people who have been historically missed out or left behind. And it was actually remarkable, the focus on the opportunity, the hopefulness that actually this transition could represent a moment of change and could bring about new opportunities for areas across the country. But that doesn't mean that there weren't fears as well, because many told us that they wanted, that too often they thought fairness is an afterthought, and instead they wanted to see fairness to be foundational, because without it, the transition won't be fair, and it won't be seen to be fair. So that's got to be a crucial part of the approach as well. The third shift people wanted to see was to move from being a policy to being done to people to being done with and by them. Too often, people argued that they were locked out of decisions, and actually they argued that we increase fairness when we involve people in the decisions that affect them, not least because they know how many of these decisions will really play out in the real world. The fourth shift was to move from individuals and silos to a whole economy and all society approach. And I think this is something that Wales and the Welsh government should be commended on, because I think the kind of cross-cutting strategy, the new ministry, the Future Generations Acts that are in place in Wales is a good example of where this is already in place, because the people we spoke to recognised that every part of the economy and society must be involved in the transition if it is to be a success. People want a partnership between government, business, workers, civil society and the public. This certainly can't be down to just individual responsibility or giving with one hand to mitigate harm done by the other. Next, people wanted to move the fifth shift from top-down policy making to national leadership and local ownership and delivery. Yes, people absolutely want strong leadership from their government, they want it from their local authority, they'll want it from the Welsh government, they'll want it from the UK government as well. But there also needs to be more local ownership and empowerment to deliver solutions that work on the ground. Sharing power, they argued, isn't a zero-sum game. And finally, I thought something that came across particularly strongly from all our jurors was the idea that we need to move from just climate alone to climate and nature together, because all of our jurors talked about the importance of nature. Yes, there may have been some impact of the effect of lockdown, where people valued in particular the access to green, to their local green spaces. But the importance that they placed on it, they felt just really wasn't sufficiently reflected in the national conversation or in our policy making. And after all, the UK overall is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, and we know that the destruction of nature is actively accelerating global heating. So achieving net zero on its own really will not be enough. So these were 6 shifts that we believe should underpin a new social contract, which we outlined in the report, which I'm just briefly going to take you through now before I just make some comments on housing. Next slide, please. So the first shift we believe should mean that should result in a people's dividend. If we're going to make the most of this opportunity, we need a guarantee that policy will be designed so that people right across the country, wherever they are, will benefit from the transition, with the greatest return accruing to those that need it most. Now, there was a whole host of policy ideas under each of these parts of the contract, which you can look at in more detail if you look at the report online on our website. But I think the crucial thing here is the principle. But we called, for example, free or more affordable public transport, the expansion of schemes for community ownership, or carbon dividend repayment schemes, so increasing payments to households on low incomes as a result of increasing carbon prices and taxes over time. Everyone must see a benefit from this transition. Second of all, we propose a fairness lock to ensure that, as I already said, that fairness is foundational on every climate and nature policy. That means the cost of all policies must be fairly assessed, so that those on the lowest incomes must not lose out. In fact, they must benefit. A fairness lock would mean that support is put in place ahead of change. We've got to see support for heat pumps, support for people to transition, support for alternatives in the form of affordable public transport before people are forced to make the change, or before they see the costs impact them. And we must put in place mechanisms to ensure we're taking decisions not just for now, but future generations as well. And the UK must make a fair contribution internationally too. And I think the rest of the UK has got a lot to learn from Wales in terms of, as I've already mentioned, the Future Generations Act, which really does enshrine that kind of decision making that the people we spoke to wanted to see. Thirdly, we argue for a people first approach. We heard time and time again from our jurors that the public want to be part of this transition. They want change that they can be involved in. They want greater information and access to it. So we propose a people first approach. They want to have a clear role in the creation of climate and nature plans. They want access to clear, accessible information about the transition through a public communications plan, and one-stop shops for support, information and guidance. One juror called for a COVID-style information campaign and perhaps not daily, but regular press conferences from governments to update citizens on the actions that are being taken. But they also want, the information from the businesses of which they consume, where they buy their goods from. They want more information from their landlords. So there's lots of information that could be provided by many actors across the sphere in civil society, in the third sector, and by government to help people understand both what the scale of the problem is, but also the potential solutions that are out there. Next slide, please. Fourthly, as our jurors told us, a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work. So we call for the devolution of far greater powers over economy, transport, and planning. In doing so, local areas will be able to shape and deliver their own responses, allowing for more ambition, policy innovation, and popular support. That local control, that ensuring that its policy isn't designed at the centre, but is instead every community and local area is able to help shape its own future in response to the climate and nature crisis, was really important to everyone we spoke to. Fifth was that point that I already mentioned earlier in terms of the shift is a whole economy, all society approach to the transition. That means government must join forces with businesses, large and small, trade unions and workers, and the whole of civil society to tackle this challenge. And finally, the sixth part of that social contract, responding to that shift around climate alone to climate and nature together, is the idea that we must value what matters, and in part valuing nature. In our report, we call for the creation of a UK-wide Nature Recovery Committee, similar legally binding targets for the environment, and a national nature service. We also call for the rest of the UK to follow the Welsh Government's lead and pass the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, and to embed wellbeing measures into the heart of all government decision-making, moving beyond GDP as the sole measure of success. So there's a whole range of policy recommendations that sit below each of those shifts and the new social contract. But fundamentally, we have argued for a much greater focus in the transition on what a fair transition looks like. Yes, we must reduce emissions. Yes, we must restore nature, but we must also focus on fairness and ensure that there's a wider creation of opportunities and benefits across Wales, across the UK, not just because that's the right thing to do, not just because it's a moment in which, if we're transforming our economy in this way, why wouldn't we try to seek to maximise the benefits? But lastly, because we believe we won't take people with us unless we maximise those opportunities and ensure that the transition is fair. Next slide, please. I just wanted to say a little bit more about homes and how this sits within that kind of framework. Now, we know that homes in Wales, and I know you'll be hearing lots more about this over the course of the day, are responsible for 15% of all demand-side greenhouse gas emissions in Wales. So we know that any plan to reduce emissions from housing can make a big contribution to reducing emissions overall. But we also know that it has the potential to provide a great contribution to those opportunities and that people's dividend that I talked about earlier. Done well, it could create well over 10,000 jobs per year. Done well, it could save households hundreds of pounds on energy bills. And done well, it could improve energy security and protect households from energy bill increases related to wholesale gas price rises. So there's a whole array of benefits that could be brought about as a result of it. And indeed, the Welsh Government already has some key schemes in place. As Jane mentioned, it recently accepted recommendations to increase the EPC rating of social rented homes to A by 2030. It has RBEDS, the area-based energy efficiency program, something that we've argued that kind of local authority-led approach, that street-by-street local area approach that should be rolled out across the UK. It has Nest, what is the free service that offers advice to help households reduce their energy bills. So there are some key components in place, but there are also wider barriers, and I just wanted to highlight some of those things and some of the things that we heard from our jurors that are kind of a key barrier to making progress in this particular area. Next slide, please. And those key barriers really are around financing, around industry challenges, around implementation barriers. So first, on the financing barriers, the upfront costs and the running costs. We know that the upfront costs on average, it costs around £10,000 a home to introduce energy efficiency measures and heat pumps. People talk about an able to pay market. For most households, that they're not able to pay. The able to pay market is somewhat of an illusion. So we must have grant schemes in place that can support households to transition, and we must also ensure that any technologies that are installed ensure that the running costs are brought down. And the UK government has got to play a role in shifting the balance of costs from gas, from electricity bills to gas, with too many green levies sitting on electricity, which is increasingly renewable, and hardly any sitting on our gas bills. But we've got to make sure that when technology like heat pumps is installed, that you have the right energy efficiency in place, because one of those financing barriers, unless you provide enough upfront grants to ensure that people have energy efficiency measures and heat pumps installed, if they just have enough to pay for heat pumps, then potentially the running costs of those heat pumps could lead to higher bills. So we've got to focus both on the upfront cost and ensuring that it's that every technology is appropriately installed, so we can bring down those energy bills for each household. Second of all, there is the industry challenges, and these really kind of divide up between the demand side challenges and the supply side challenges. So on the demand side challenges, one of the key things that installers and the industry have told us, and this really does more relate to UK government policy, but obviously has knock-on effects to the industry, which operates across borders, is the idea that we need long-term confidence in government policy, and we haven't seen that thus far. Though admittedly, the UK government is bringing out its own strategy for England today, which might help with the broader industry, retrofit industry across the UK. But there's also the supply side challenges. There are issues around the attractiveness of the industry in terms of people that want to go into it, and we're going to need thousands of people, tens of thousands of people across the UK to work in this industry, as well as the time, cost, and availability of training. Those things have got to be addressed as well. And then there are the implementation barriers. There's a lack of awareness and understanding amongst the public about the contribution that their boilers make. A vast majority of people we polled together with YouGov weren't even aware that their boiler was such a problem in terms of emissions. There's also issues around public trust for people that want to see something installed in their home. They do have trust issues around giving people access to their home, about the level of disruption it's going to cause them, and whether indeed the work is going to be of a sufficient quality. And public policy all has a role within that, as does the role of landlords and housing associations too. And there's also other implementation barriers, such as around local capacity. We need to see that kind of local area approach, but we don't necessarily yet have the local capacity at local authority level to deliver it. And then just on to my final slide around what's needed. Our mantra really is around standards, skills, cash, communication, and capacity. At every level of government, we need clear standards, clear legal deadlines, clear phase-out dates for oil and gas boilers, and clear points for changes for when people might need to move over from a gas boiler to a heat pump. So in an ideal world, we would see tough regulation in the private rented sector, clear targets, and then legal phase-out legal phase-out dates in terms of standards in the across the home sector. Secondly, we need investment in skills. As I said, we do need tens of thousands of workers to be skilled up and trained in this area, and we do need a big focus on all governments and local authorities in the education and skills that are needed to do that. Thirdly, we need the cash. We need public funding to support these grants, and we need sufficiently large grants to support households to be able to shift across. Fourthly, we do need that communication. It might be a COVID style campaign. It might be something different. We've called for something called a Tell Sid style campaign, the advertising campaign that was used to encourage people to buy private shares in the privatised British Gas in the 1980s. It was shown all across television. We need a similar kind of campaign from the government to tell people about what the problems are and also what help is on offer to support people to make the change. And lastly, we need a focus and investment on local capacity to deliver those and scale up those schemes like the RBED scheme, both in Wales but also across the country, because without that capacity at the local level, we're not going to be able to make the change at the pace that the climate and nature emergency demand. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through what we believe need to be a shift in our general approach to the climate and nature crisis, and also some of the barriers, but also potential solutions to overcoming the particular issues in housing retrofit as well. And I know I've run over time, so I will definitely stop there.
Luke, thank you so much. I think that one of the really interesting experiences for me when I came and joined you at the IPPR's Climate Assembly was the immensely serious way in which those people who participated in the Assembly tackled the issues, and not for themselves, but very much in the context of their whole community. So your points about fairness and collaboration, about looking to the long term, about prevention, all those issues which are actually enshrined in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, the 5 ways of working. You know, people should think long term, they should be preventative, they should collaborate with each other, they should make sure that people who are having things done to them are involved in the decisions that are made, and they should integrate outcomes. And I was really interested that your climate assemblies actually came to those conclusions themselves, didn't they, in the context of best practice. I just wondered whether you might think about, in terms of this particular audience, housing professionals, the vast majority from housing associations, tenants' representatives, how would you advise both the housing associations and tenants to apply what you've been saying today to the way in which the decarbonisation programmes might work in housing in Wales?
Thanks. Yeah, no, very happy to do that. I think that the reason I kind of took it through, because I think the key principles are the same when we were talking about those shifts and that kind of social contract. So first of all, I think public involvement and information is really important. So that means involving tenants in the discussion around what they want to see in their homes, maybe highlighting the problem to them, that, you know, so that raises awareness amongst tenants about the contribution that their homes are making to the climate crisis. As I said, like polling suggests that from across the country, that actually many people just don't know that there is even a problem. So there is a role there for housing associations just to raise the issues with their tenants, and the same with kind of tenant representation representative organisations as well. So there's just really a kind of an awareness raising. Second of all, is I think is recognising those real crucial issues around public trust. Different housing associations will be taking different approaches, different tenant organisations will be taking different approaches to supporting tenants to actually go through this process. I think it can be disruptive. There's no getting away from it. It is, as I said, like this is going from a transition in the background where people might have noticed a bit of different, a bit of additional money that they've got to spend on green levies on their energy bill, to things that actually, someone is going to need to come into their home, potentially implement energy efficiency measures, potentially shift over their boiler to a heat pump. People need to be able to trust the work that's going on, need to understand what's going to happen. And I think there's a real responsibility on government, on housing associations, on local authorities to ensure that all of that work is done to the highest quality, because we can't get the worst thing we could do in terms of undermining public confidence in the transition is to be in a situation where shoddy installations happen, technology doesn't work, and also that the information isn't provided to ensure people understand how to run the technology. It does require running your heating system in a different way, and therefore information is crucial. And I think lastly, I would say is around cash and money. And I think this is less something that I think probably, I know that some housing associations will have different financing models, and we've seen those kind of hybrid public-private financing models where housing associations are able to raise some money from the private market together with some public funding and some with their own funding to roll out kind of energy efficiency schemes and home retrofit schemes within their own stock. But there does need to be a commitment from all governments really to ensure that there is that kind of cash in place for those that want to transition across. And in housing associations, most tenants, it's going to be very much beyond their means, and therefore housing associations will need the government to stump up the cash to support them to be able to make that transition, because otherwise there's going to be a trade-off for housing associations between potentially new stock or retrofitting their homes. So I think those three things are probably public trust, information, and ensuring that the cash is in place, and that the housing associations are lobbying the government for as much cash as possible to be able to expedite this transition as fast as possible.
Yeah, I think those are really, really important points. Thank you for those. I think that there is a peculiar issue potentially with a government such as the Welsh government, where the funding for the government comes in terms of the allocation to portfolios in England. So, and the Welsh government is always ambitious about the very large range of areas within its portfolio. You didn't actually mention regulation. And it does strike me that although there's government regulation at the moment, for example, where Welsh government is committed to the 2030 outcomes, and we can explore these with the Deputy Minister shortly, and it has put legislation in place in terms of net zero by 2050. I do wonder whether there are opportunities for sectors to almost offer up a level playing field of regulation to governments, which they know that it's in a sense will constrain them to do good in this particular area. You mentioned the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and of course that was government passing legislation that constrains it to behave sustainably. And I almost wonder whether that model in Wales is capable of greater interpretation. If you could see a piece of regulation in government that would help drive this agenda forward particularly, what might it be?
I think there's probably a few things. One is, and we've not seen some of this, unfortunately, in the UK strategy UK government strategy that's been published today. But I think there is lots that can be done, both in terms of, I guess, the sector setting its own standards and targets, as well as the Welsh government as well. But I think the three things we need to see are as follows. One is we do need to see a kind of, a legal ban on the sale of new gas and oil boilers. We've argued by 2028 and 2033, respectively. Secondly, I think there was a clear argument for this might be less relevant for some housing associations, but depending on the length of stay of many of their tenants, but across tenure really, for point of sale, point of re-rent changeover. So when a landlord is turning over its property, there's a new tenant coming in. At that point, should they be required? Should they mandate themselves that property will be upgraded? Because obviously, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key points, one of the key problems is the disruption, and why not use those moments to actually to do that. And I've forgotten my third point, which is probably not. But I guess but one thing I would say about why regulation and how that can help as you're right, in the absence of government cash, and I think it is unfortunate that we haven't seen a greater commitment from the UK government today in terms of the cash for its strategy, because as you rightly point out, we'll see less cash as a result in terms of for the devolved parliaments, is that setting this regulation can drive market innovation and behaviour and private finance as well. So, one of the really good things that the UK government has done is the phase out of petrol and diesel vehicles, because that now means that all of the automotive companies are now investing in electric vehicle manufacture. They know that date is coming, and that is forcing market innovation. So we do need greater public investment, but actually that regulation can set the mission for the private sector to innovate. It knows it's got to meet that, and that also means that they can plan. It means that they can plan investment. It means that they can plan investment in the skills upgrade, investing in the workforce, and none of that will happen unless you have that long-term certainty. So regulation and that self-imposed thing, if it's meaningful, that you mentioned, could be really important in driving behaviour change within the market and by housing providers, public and private as well.
No, thank you for that, because I mean, obviously building regulations are very important in terms of new build homes, but with the experience of Wales, with having the largest number of poor quality pre-1919 homes, there are very, very different types of challenge here. So if we think about that point about cross tenure point of sale rent requirement for upgrading, that's something that potentially can be picked up in workshops. And in terms of one of the other dangers for Welsh government is the fact that if money is taken out of existing budgets for anything, no additional funding comes to Wales. Is there an opportunity for pension funds?
There absolutely is, and I think we're already seeing the creation of kind of public-private hybrid models. Now, we've argued that actually, in the short term, it would have been better to see greater public investment. Again, this is directed at the UK government, because that would have helped pump prime the market, as it were. But there are opportunities, I think, for and you're seeing this in some local authorities across the country that are entering into partnerships with long-term patient investors that are interested in investing in this because they can see a payback in the longer term. However, we do need to see longer term reform to the energy system to enable this to happen, because at the moment it's quite difficult for an investor to see that return come back to them, because the mechanisms to do so are difficult. At the moment, if an investor provides that investment outside of these kind of particular schemes that I'm talking about, the payback is obviously to the individuals in terms of the tenants on their energy bills. So creating ways in which mechanisms in which to ensure that those savings are passed on to the investors will be crucial. And things like green mortgages by private financial institutions from the major banks as well could be ways of doing that. But we do need to see more innovation at local authority level and at the national level and at the UK level as well, to ensure that to see that brought about. You need to create the conditions in order to do that. And again, that kind of regulation and targets will be crucial to kind of setting the direction and giving investors the confidence that this is a market that's worth them investing in.
Thank you so much, Luke. I mean, I think that's such a good beginning to our conference. I know that you're having to go off now to actually hear exactly what the UK government is going to announce on heat pumps, etc. But we're really grateful for the IPPR's input to the work in the South Wales valleys, and the fact that that work in the South Wales valleys is guiding, along with your other climate assemblies, is guiding the way in which the IPPR responds to the major challenges facing us all. So we wish you all the best with your work. So thank you again, diolch yn fawr iawn. And we look forward to staying in touch with you as we move forward on this very complex but incredibly important agenda, not least because the tenants and in fact, indeed, the people of Wales are negatively affected by the current way in which the UK stacks fossil fuel subsidies onto renewable energy. And it irritates me beyond measure, as somebody who has always supported renewable energy, that I effectively pay to keep the gas prices cheaper than the renewable energy I pay for, which is actually cheaper in terms of delivery. So there is so much that we need to change, and we look forward to working with you on being part of that. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thanks very much for having me. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. And to you all as delegates, we'll be joined by Lee Waters, the Minister, at 10:30. He is doing back-to-back meetings today. So can I suggest that we go off air for a few minutes, and if you can be back by 10:28, we'll be ready to meet the Minister. Diolch yn fawr iawn.